welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your Nubu host, Madelyn.
I'm your gibberish host, Emma.
And thanks for tuning in to this week's show. This week it's my side quest, so we are going to be talking about fictional languages in games.
Yeah, woo!
And probably generally, sort of. You kind of can't talk about fictional languages without some Klingon, some Dothraki.
Yeah.
Some various Elvish.
Yeah.
Unsurprisingly, obviously inspired by Clickbait Boyfriend and Maya's experience with Tunic recently, which has its own little fictional writing system. Its own writing system, I guess. I don't know, it's weird to call some of these things fictional languages. They are languages that appear in fictions.
They're usually, most of the ones for, TV are called, conlangs.
Mm-hmm.
For constructed languages, as opposed to fictional languages. I mean, you could say all languages are constructed also, but at that point you're just splitting hairs.
That feels like something a linguist would insist on. They're like, no, constructed languages. Not fictional. Take us seriously.
I guess so.
I hope everyone is prepared for me just over and over this episode to be like, this seems like too much effort. Some of this stuff for some of these games, I'm like, dude, you didn't have to do this. This was too much.
To be fair, all of those examples, though, are people who are clearly they like doing this, right?
I don't really...
Most of the ones I saw where I was like, that's a lot, felt like the person talking about it was like, this was fun for me. So I say more power to them.
I don't really mean it from the perspective, the perspective of the linguists or whoever, the specialists of whatever they're hiring working on it. I'm like, yeah, of course, that sounds dope. Absolutely. I also would like to be paid to do exactly what my very niche training.
They're apparently not paid very much, though, so...
Well, I know.
We're pointing that out.
Roll with me here. I also, if I had very niche... Clickbait Boyfriend, I'm sure would love to have one of these... Actually, he would hate this, but, it's a good example. He would love, I'm sure, to be the philosophical consultant on whatever, the next Elder Scrolls, or...
Sure.
The next Legend of Zelda, right? And so in the same way, it's yeah, of course the linguists love creating a language. These are these are people who got PhDs in
These are some nerds.
And respectful. But I read about I'm thinking about think about all the work that this created for literally everyone else on this production.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know. Probably could have just used some gibberish. I'm kidding. That's the most extreme example. But some of this seems to have gone so far into it that I'm like, oh, somebody regretted suggesting this.
Genuinely, though, in a lot of cases, there are examples where gibberish is just the correct... yes, you could just use gibberish if you wanted to. Well thought out gibberish, but still gibberish.
We'll talk about that. I mean, for gibberish to even read as gibberish, there's thought that goes into it, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of wild to think about.
You can't just do key smash language.
Yeah. Exactly. Clickbait Boyfriend, before I started researching for this and I was feeling a little behind, he was like, no, you don't have to research. Just do the entire thing in a made-up language.
Something I do think about sometimes, thinking I brought up key smashes, is you have to think about your key smashes, too.
Yeah, if it comes out wrong, it doesn't read as a key smash.
Yeah, you can't just smash your keyboard. It, has to be, a well-constructed key smash.
Yeah.
Food for thought.
And that's really at the heart of what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
So I think, Emma, you had a good note at the top of your notes about how, not all, sort of on one hand, obviously, but not all fictional languages are created equal.
Yes. So I think you can split it into, two big categories of one where you have fictional languages that are somewhat complete, quote unquote, in that you can translate them, right? And they have, some sort of grammar rules, You could make like a sentence out of the words that you know, for example. And then there's fictional like languages, quote unquote, where it's either like, I think you can have a range of either like you have a couple of made up words to like suggest that there is another language, but nobody actually like speaks it, or you have something that feels like another language but isn't actually like translatable. It's just gibberish or just vibes. It's a vibe language. And then within languages that are quote unquote more real in that you could speak them, there's like a variation between like things that are really language like, where if you're just going outside into all mediums, you could look at Tolkien or Klingon or whatever. Those are like complete languages. And then you have some where you're just essentially making ciphers, right? So it sounds like another language, but when you're translating it, it really is just like, this corresponds to either like this letter or this hiragana or this phonetic sound. And it just sort of scrambled to make it look like another language, but it's pretty simple to translate.
And I would say that almost, in our research anyway, the vast majority of game languages that fall into that first category, probably the vast majority of game languages are the gibberish version.
Especially if you just need like words to put on environmental details, I think, that aren't English. I bet a lot of those are just like cool looking symbols. I found a couple of those in research where it's just like, I put some cool looking symbols on this.
And it even widens that even further, you know, maybe we'll probably talk about Animal Crossing a little bit more later, but you know, in a video that Polygon did on Animal Crossing that I was watching, in Animal Crossing's language, you know, you could even go back to, well, any game that has kind of like a beep, beep, boop, boop sound that goes along with its, you know, written out dialogue. Like, that's sort of I mean, it's like weird to call that a language when compared to the amount of work that goes into some of these. But it's like, it sort of is. If those beep, beep, boops have any kind of like a pattern to them.
Yeah.
Right. That is like especially if you're tracing back to a time when including that sort of audio would have been challenging from a cartridge space perspective. That is sort of like a very early version.
Yes, it is supposed to suggest language. Like for a lot of those, you'll have different pitches of beep, beep, boops, depending on who's talking. It'll correspond to pauses and stuff. So it's supposed to suggest language, even if it's not its own language itself.
It's just weird, you know, obviously on any video game language breakdown, you know, Simlish is going to be on there. And it's weird to think like, okay, like Simlish has a little bit more to it than this, but in many ways, even though like we're obviously like, oh yeah, like the stuff the Sims say, like that's a game language, right? It's not actually very different at all from just a beep, beep, boop, boop kind of that's happening on your like Game Boy game.
Yeah. It's more because it sounds more like words, it is more recognizable, and it has, you know, there are phrases that repeat depending on what the sim is saying now, right? Because you can sort of speak Simlish in some ways because you can just memorize phrases. But it is just meant to suggest language rather than being its own language.
So it's all a spectrum. But anyway, to circle back to I think what I was actually trying to say when I began this little clause here, if you're just looking at that first category of things that are like more language-like, right? The vast majority of those in games are just ciphers of some kind.
Yeah.
It starts to get a little bit murkier, which one is more prevalent when you have something that needs to be spoken. But the vast majority of these like constructed languages, yeah, are just like, it's a fancy way to write basically English.
Yeah.
Which, you know, and I when I say that, right, that comes across as sounding maybe a little bit like, oh, like it's only English, like talking down to it. Like, no, like that's fine. Not to like the lightest of light spoilers for the Tunic language here, right? But ultimately, it is basically English. The way that it's constructed, I won't spoil in any way, but you're not reading words in a different language. The words that you translate are ultimately English words. Mm-hmm. And that was dope. It was really cool to translate that. We felt very accomplished in doing it. And I loved going back and reading about that part of the game in preparing for this podcast and seeing the progression from like the early stuff that's like Tunic's untranslatable language to look at this dork on Reddit, this freak on Reddit who translated the language of Tunic to like think pieces that are like translating the language of Tunic watered my crops and healed my mind.
To be fair, that makes sense for like a progression of like how long it would take you to get to each of those. You know, like the first people writing about it, like, you can't translate this, right? Yeah. And then someone starts translating it and someone who's not into it is like, whoa, look, they're translating it. And then if you were translating it too, then you would be the last one writing it. So that makes sense. It's true.
It all makes sense. It was just very funny to me. But you know, there was like, that would have been like, one, impossible if it wasn't English words. But two, like, I don't think it would have added anything. Like, there's no reason for that to be something other than English. Although Clickbait Boyfriend and I did like have a good chat about if it makes Tunic sort of unlocalizable.
Yeah, I was curious about that too.
Because of, maybe I'll talk about this like not on the podcast with you because I don't want to spoil it, but because of how the phoneme system in Tunic works, I think that you could do it for another language. It would just be a lot of work. And would probably work better for some languages than other languages.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was cool though. It was cool, and it didn't need to be anything other. Like, some things will tell you that Tunic is not exactly a cipher. I would still put it under the category. It's like a more complicated one, perhaps. One of the articles you posted had a technical term for this, and I can't remember what it was. Anyway, I won't talk about this more because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. But I still consider it's still like a cipher. It's just like a slightly fancier cipher. That's probably not technically how that word is used, though. This whole episode is just going to be me running wild over linguistics as a category of academic learning.
That's okay.
I'm like, it's basically a cipher. Linguist in the audience. No, it's not. It's not what a cipher is.
Yeah, some other ones that are basically ciphers or letter scrambles, I guess, if you want to go for a less technical term that we might be misusing. Al-Bhed in Final Fantasy X. The spoken language seems to be just like a mix of English and Japanese sort of mixed up. But the written language is actually different based on whether you're playing the localization or the Japanese version. So the localization is just like these letters are swapped. Japanese is like it is katakana and are swapped, and then you put it in hiragana, essentially. So it's like a little bit of an extra step in there. Which those are the two different like basic alphabets of Japanese, if you are not familiar. Hylian is also basically a cipher. They'll have symbols that represent English letters, actually, or it depends on what era of Zelda you're talking about, which I think is really fascinating. Wild. They've changed Hylian in like different sections of the Zelda timeline, essentially. So some of them are based on English, some of them are based on Japanese. I think there were some others that were based on different ones. Tears of the Kingdoms, Hylian is based on English, except you also see some ancient Hylian that is apparently based on Middle English instead of English, to make it older, I guess. Such a funny little thing.
Like, whose job was that, do you think?
Somebody's. I think that's, like, it is neat, though, to be like, it's basically a pretty simple system, no matter, like, which era of Zelda you're talking about, but it is a pretty simple way to be like, these things are connected, but there's differences between them at the same time. I read a few little anecdotes that, like, if you know one, you don't know the others, you have to learn them separately, even though they look similar, which is interesting. And just based on how the Zelda timeline is, makes sense for the world building that they're trying to do. Right. Some of them are evolutions of the others, and some of them are side timelines, and some of them are whatever, you know?
This is why they had to delay the game.
I don't think so. I don't think that was why. There's Dino Talk in Star Fox, which is apparently, like, really basic letter scramble. And that's very easy to understand what they're saying. And then Nier doesn't actually have a cipher or anything. They just were like, hey, there's this weird alphabet that some rando made so he could talk to angels and his occult stuff. That seems like it would work for our setting. And so they just used the angelic alphabet, which is essentially like a combination of the Hebrew and Enochian alphabet. That some guy made in like 1500s or something.
That guy was really born too soon. He could have been the there's that one guy in all these articles. Peterson? Right, what's his name? I have to look it back up. Something Peterson. I'll look up his first name while I'm talking. But, like, man, that guy who made the angel alphabet, born too soon.
Really born too soon, yeah.
He could have been David J. Peterson, who's the guy that made Dothraki and Valerian for Game of Thrones, and, like, just, like, if there's a fictional language in a show, like, probably this guy made it.
Yeah. And those are some of the, like, more direct, like, we've just letter scrambled or assigned symbols instead of letters or done a cipher type languages.
Which is, you know, again, really quite effective, especially if your game is going to be just text-based. You know, and even that, it's like, oh, you can probably combine that with, like, mostly gibberish pronunciation to some extent.
Yeah. One of the other, like, the think pieces on this that I read by Alan Zucconi split it into, like, you can make a fictional alphabet, right? Where you just have an alphabet that you're using to spell things instead of whatever alphabet you normally use. A fictional language, which is the one where you have, like, grammar and stuff, and a faux language, which essentially is just meant to suggest language, which I also thought were 3 pretty useful categories to think of it as.
So do you want to talk about real languages next, or do you want to talk about gibberish a little more?
In this think piece, he pointed to, like, there are real world examples of, like, faux languages that, like old people, like, just made up for funds. There's the Codex Seraphinius that was in 1981 that they just were like, here's a funny little thing with fake writing. And there's also, more seriously, like something called the Voynich manuscript, which is like a codex of some sort that's from the 1400s. And there's, like, drawings and a script that they don't know, and nobody's been able to decide whether it's, like, a language they don't know, a constructed language, a code of some sort, or if just somebody made this whole manuscript with meaningless nonsense, which I think is so funny.
Again, born too soon. Or too late, right? Like, I guess, like, maybe you should have been born many, many, many years before.
When they were making languages.
Like, we're building a real language.
Exactly.
That's how it works, right? Somebody just, like, sat down and was like, here's how we're going to talk.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how it worked. I think it was God, maybe? I don't know. I'm kidding.
Yes. This guy, the guy who made Rocky, probably should have been born as God. Speaking of, great tie-in, Emma. He did say in an article about this kind of fictional language creation generally has been majorly on the rise in the past 15 to 20 years or so. And obviously J.R.R. Tolkien was doing this long before, and the people of this manuscript were doing it long before, and God did it long before that. but to bring it back to God, this guy who makes all these conlangs pointed to the Passion of the Christ. I love an opportunity to talk about the Passion of the Christ on Talk This. I've published work on the Passion of the Christ. Not a fan. But that movie is all performed in Aramaic, which is a brilliant filmmaking tactic on the part of these people. Which Aramaic is a real language, but it is not a real language that anyone speaks anymore. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I actually don't think that they would have really been speaking Aramaic. The Aramaic they speak in the movie is not correct, but whatever. Mm-hmm. Let's not get into an analysis of the Passion of the Christ here. But because that movie made a lot of money, to put it mildly, it potentially convinced Hollywood executives that people would tolerate sitting through a movie that had a language that they didn't and could not know. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Lord of the Rings movie is also making a lot of money. Also contributed to that. And so that's led to this bigger explosion in these crafted conlangs across media, as people think, there's more and more dorks out there who will tolerate this.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't really remember where that was coming from. Language. I got distracted.
I did think it was interesting. So BioWare is one company that has put together very simple languages, because they make both sci-fi and fantasy type games where there are different races that might speak different languages. It seems like they've had this guy, they've done their own work, their writers and stuff, but they had this guy, Wolf Weichly, do both, I think Jade Empire is BioWare. Yeah. So he did the language for Jade Empire, which is Thophan, and apparently also did a bunch of languages for Dragon Age, which they basically didn't end up using at all. And there was this Times piece where they were talking about it, and I thought it was interesting that he does say at the end, that's one of the questions at the end is will the players even notice this? For Jade, this was on Jade Empire, and especially for that one where it's Asian inspired, right? It has more Asian pronunciations and stuff because it's set in an Asian inspired setting. And he said I can hear the difference, but I don't know if anyone else can tell the difference between this and gibberish, just listening to it, which is such an interesting thing, and probably why maybe they felt we can cut a lot of these languages that we've done for Dragon Age, because unless you are really invested in the game, right, or a linguist, I guess, you're not gonna realize necessarily that it's a constructed language, right? Versus just a real language versus nothing, right?
On the other hand, though, it's harder to create correct sounding gibberish than you would think.
Sure.
So while it's certainly easier to generate a bunch of semi-fake sentences, I think, for a language that you're not going to need for a huge amount of your game than it is to create a whole language. I'm sure plenty of people are oh, this won't be that hard, and then they come up with some stuff and it's this sounds like someone is speaking gibberish. Mm-hmm. Or it just doesn't sound like what someone speaking in something that is recognizable as a language would sound like.
Yeah.
So it's a balance. I'm sympathetic to the big challenge of this, right? Especially as we're, long into a full voice acting era. That makes it even harder.
Yeah.
Right? It's one thing to be able to create a sort of like fake, even, you know, not even like getting into a different alphabet, right? Of just being like, I'm going to create some fake looking semi-English words. It's another thing to have those semi-English words sound like anything when somebody says them.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of the ways to do it simply, both for making a new language or making something that sort of sounds like language, is to pull from existing languages in terms of like sounds and sentence construction and pronunciation of things. There's a couple like Joseph Fares, Game Award winner. Joseph Fares.
Game Award winner.
There's a fictional language, and I think it was his studio's first game, Brother, A Tale of Two Sons. I put songs in the notes, but it's sons. Where it's gibberish, but it's based on like Lebanese Arabic, which he's part Lebanese, so he was just pulling from that for that. Near Replicant / Gestalt has a city where you can't understand the people at first, but they have voice acting. And it's essentially they just ran hiragana through a scrambler. So you listen to it and you're like, that sounds vaguely Japanese, but not... That's not how you say words. But it sounds correct because it's using a lot of existing sounds. They're just put in the incorrect order. Versus, like, you know, you pull from existing noises, like Thofaning Jade Empire pulls from various Asian languages. I think the Skyrim, they said a lot from, like, Old English, essentially. So you have to start from something if you want to do it simply, essentially.
Otherwise, I mean, just listener, you right now try to do a gibberish sentence for yourself. Right? It's probably going to be like boogle, gooble, dooble, dooble.
I think, interestingly, although it puts a lot on the voice actor, but I think that when it is voice acted, it actually really helps because you can put familiar sentence intonation on it, even if it's gibberish. Versus if you're writing something out, I think that's actually harder to make something that looks like a real sentence.
That's true, but also this sounds like a nightmare for voice actors.
Yeah.
Every story I read about this, except like The Sims, where it just sounds like they got to have a fun time. But everything I've read about this process for voice actors just sounds like, oh, this sounds horrible.
You know, at least you don't have to worry. Well, maybe you do have to worry a little bit, but you have to worry less about, like, horribly mispronouncing words than when you have to do, like, a couple of words in a foreign language, for example.
I guess, except that some of these projects seem to take their fake language very seriously.
I guess if you've made it, yeah.
I don't mean it in like a, again, I'm sounding like disparaging of that. I don't mean that. Like, obviously, if you want to take this very seriously and you want it to be accurate, like, you should do that. But also, like, yikes, that seems really hard.
I mean, ideally, if you want your fictional language to be correct, you are actually spending time on the voice acting, as opposed to how voice acting is usually done. So,
well, but see, even that. Okay, so like, let me talk about the like the first like really constructed one of these that I was reading about in preparing for this episode. Is the language the languages in Far Cry Primal, where they brought in, which takes place like thousands and thousands of years in the past, right? So they brought in linguists who are experts in Proto-Indo-European, which is a real, like, very early language, right? And they had them, like, take that and create a language for each of the three tribes that was kind of, like, related to each other and related to this language. And, like, the linguists seem to have gotten very into this and, like, gotten a whole community of linguists to do that. And I hope they were paid adequately for that work. But, like the lead actor was having to have, like, daily language lessons with the linguist on it. And they were, like, doing, like, immersion training with some of the other actors. I'm like, that is a lot.
For me, it's like they're paid for their time theoretically. So like, I don't know. That sounds like it'd be fun if I'm being paid my normal rate for that time. But that is dependent on that.
No, I mean, that's fair. And like, let's hope, right? I'm always skeptical of voice actors being adequately paid for their time. So like,
Right.
Let's hope.
Theoretically, they would have had been paid something for that.
It's just another weird and interesting example of like gradual scope creep in games, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's a wild thing to have to be like, we have to put a bunch of time into people learning this language that we've made up, or it's gonna sound bad.
Yeah.
Like, tell that to the Tetris guy. Like, I don't know. I'm joking, but like that. It's just like as everything has to get bigger and bigger and bigger in games. This is not the kind of thing that I would have thought of at all, but like adding a fictional language adds a ton of people who have to create it and adds a bunch of time for like figuring that out and people knowing how to write in it and that sort of thing. It's just like another weird little tendril hanging off there.
Theoretically, though, if you are doing a whole game dubbed in a constructed language, you don't then have to, if you're localizing it, you just have to do, like, the subtitles.
That's true, but except, like, it seems to me like there are very few games that are actually fully in the constructed language.
Yeah.
It's just like, oh, this tribe speaks it.
Yeah. I liked, there's a language in Panzer Dragoon, and someone in like a really old article on the making of Panzer Dragoon Saga were talking about like why they did it, and I thought it was really funny of like they were like, well, you know, Japanese people at the time didn't really think of their language as a cool thing, which incredibly funny.
Yeah.
And then they were like, if they're speaking English, it would have seemed too Hollywood. So we just decided to make something up. Incredibly funny. It felt cool, is essentially what that boils down to. We wanted language to be cool and sexy.
I hate to say this, but this feels like the kind of thing that companies are going to try to outsource to AI.
I mean, they're going to try to do all of it. It's all.
I mean, I know they're going
to try all of
AI.
it.
I'm just like, I can see exactly how it works here, where it's like they try to outsource it to AI and they get something back that like doesn't quite sound right, basically.
I'm actually curious if this would be too beyond the capabilities of where it is right now.
Right, like creating a made-up language.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think, like, to be clear, what I'm saying here is I don't think you could outsource right now anyway.
Well, yeah, I don't think they're going to try to outsource everything right now when it can't do that anyway. But, like, you can ask an AI for, like, synonyms, but I don't know if it could be, like, here's made-up synonyms that aren't, like, real words, you know?
Well, but I'm thinking more of, like, yeah, like, of course, right now, and probably for a long time, and ever, really, I don't think that you could have an AI necessarily make up, like, the full fictional language of the fake Proto-Europeans, or Proto-Indo-European, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't be surprised if people are going to try to be like, well, I need, like, 3 lines in something that sounds like elf. Like, can you make something up for me? And it's either going to come back, like, totally plagiarized from Tolkien, or not really sounding like an actual language. I don't know. I'd be curious. Because it feels like the kind of thing that people would be like, haha, I'm not going to pay a professor to do this. Yeah. I'm just going to have a robot do it for me.
Yeah.
Because, you know, before you think about it, it's like, oh yeah, like, of course you can just, like, make up gibberish. Like, how hard is that? Right? But it's hard.
Yeah. This is sort of off topic, but a while ago I watched a video on the making of Avatar, James Cameron's Avatar.
Yep.
And they brought in like a ton of people to make like truly alien like culture and music. 'Cause this one was on the music particularly. And they talked about how actually when they showed them like all the work they put into this like truly alien sound that does not sound like any world music ever made, they were like, actually, can we just have some orchestral scores? I don't think people will like this.
Yeah.
And I think that connects to, like, the work done on a lot of things here of, like, you make, like, a full language that sounds so different, and then at the end of the day, they're like, actually, I don't know if people will really be into this. Let's just, we can take a couple words.
Well, what's funny to me, I mean, this is not exactly analogous to this, but with this Far Cry Primal example, in the end, like, they use the language, but in the end they were like, well, we have to make sure, though, that, like, it's still understandable, basically from, like, the body language.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, why did you hire, like, 1 million linguists to put together a realistic language, if in the end it was like, well, let's just make sure their facial expressions convey it.
Yeah.
But it does get into, you know, there's different things that you want from the sound of a made-up language. Like, I'm using the word, I've gone even further away from fictional. I'm like, made up. Made up language.
All language is made up, Madelyn.
Yeah. But, like, you know, in some cases you want it to sound like something authentic, right? You want it to sound real, because that's important for your world building. And in other cases you want something like Simlish, where you kind of deliberately don't want it to sound like an actual language. Because if it did, like if Simlish sounded real, one, it would have to be real, which it is not really. And two, you wouldn't have as much of an opportunity for players to kind of create their own emergent inner lives for their Sims,
mm-hmm.
which is, of course, like a key part of what's appealing about those games.
Mm-hmm.
But fun fact, they were originally considering using Navajo or Ukrainian for The Sims.
So weird.
I just cannot imagine.
The two most unrecognizable foreign languages out there, Navajo and Ukrainian.
I just can't imagine not having aged well. Like, imagine.
No, I mean, of course not. No.
Like, imagine if The Sims were in there using this, like, it's like colonizer. Like, what? Yeah. It's wild. Like, I'm glad they didn't do that, because, like, I can't imagine the think pieces.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully they would have, if they had done with that at first, hopefully by The Sims 3, they would have been like, actually, maybe this was a bad idea.
Yeah.
You would hope. But, yeah.
Well, shout out to the improv actors, the improv training that led to the creation of Simlish. Because they really were like, we do an improv game that's like this sometimes. And the developers were like, let's do that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and you know, so while we're talking about gibberish, I want to talk about Animal Crossing a little bit. Animal Crossing is a weird case, I think.
Well, they are basically saying the words, right?
In some of the games. So here's the deal with Animal Crossing. So they've, like, changed how they do the speech over the course of the series. I watched an interesting video about this. So in the initial release, right, like just the Japanese only one, I can't remember exactly where this changed, but in some of the early releases, yeah, they have this, like, it's basically they're saying the words, like each letter ends up like corresponding to a sound, sort of, so it doesn't come out exactly like the word, but it comes out very much like it, and it comes out much closer to it in Japanese, apparently, just because of how those, you know, that writing system is set up.
Well, because of how the language is, it actually, right?
Well, yes, but it some of
because
what I was reading is
English
like,
pronounces A in like 5 different ways, but Japanese doesn't. It just pronounces A.
That's true. What I also meant, though, is that I think Animal Crossing does some stuff where it's like each letter corresponds to a sound that isn't necessarily like perfectly the sound of the... Anyway, yes, because of how the language is set up, but also...
Yeah, my impression was just that they had like one pronunciation for ah in English, but A can be ah or A or I or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't actually come out necessarily sounding like the exact word, because the word it's in might not pronounce A that way.
But in some of the kind of middle early Animal Crossings, like between the I can't remember the order of this, I'm sorry, Animal Crossing fans, like New Leaf has this Animalese, is what they call this, right? But the ones between the first one and New Leaf just have the BBB. They don't pronounce it anymore. They don't have anything that corresponds to the words. It's weird. It's a weird, like, unacknowledged, like, change. They picked some where they were going to have them have, like, a language, and some where they weren't. Which might have, like, the video sort of suggested this might have had to do with sort of, like, ideals around localization at the time. Of, you know, in some of these earlier Animal Crossings, they pretty much wipe anything that would identify the culture where it's taking place.
Right.
So that means that, like, there's neither cherry blossoms nor is Halloween celebrated on your island, basically. And that's changed. Like, that's, you know, a lot of these cultural things have reemerged in some of the more recent Animal Crossings. But it makes sense in that case that, like, you wouldn't necessarily want the speech to suggest the pattern of any particular, the actual language, and I just want it to be sort of more genericized everywhere.
Interesting.
Yeah, Tom Nook sounds a little different in Japanese than he does in English, which is super weird because of, like, what a weird thing to put any effort into doing, but they do. So all the different ways that you can make gibberish are fascinating to me. It's like, why, like, you just wouldn't think of like Animal Crossing, like, it's just gibberish, right? It's like pretty much just gibberish.
Yeah.
But it's wild, like, how much thought and planning must have gone into exactly what that gibberish should sound like and why.
Yeah. Now there are a couple of games that are actually about translating a false language. Like you said, Tunic is sort of about that. Tangentially, I guess it is sort of about that, right? Yeah. But more directly,
sort of. I was thinking about this, that actually I don't think we learned anything, like, essential from it, but it was fun.
But there's other ones. There's a game called Sethian, which is essentially like you get a notebook and you're talking to, like, this sort of computer program that's in an unknown language and attempting to translate it, essentially. So this is very directly like the game is to understand this language and pick up all of its rules. I thought it was interesting that, like, even stuff that's, like, more complicated languages that you construct, the developer, Kooning, said that, like, it doesn't really, you know, as language develops, you develop more words or weird quirks or different dialects of saying things, right? And a lot of constructed languages won't actually have that because they don't actually have a history of people having spoken them. So you can really, like, rely on rules, right? Like, the rules are how it works.
Yeah.
So as opposed to, like, English, where whatever, I'll end a sentence with a participle if I want to.
That's
whatever. But that's what I'm saying, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
When I played a couple years ago was Heaven's Vault, which is also about translating, but with more of a archaeologist.
Emma's experimenting with a new
archaeological
right
bent
now.
to it, of you're going around to different ruins and finding examples of these ancient speak and then learning to translate it, and there's some context around that may help you understand what it's trying to say, right? It's a very cool idea. They talk about in all their interviews, like, they compare it to being like Guitar Hero of linguistics. In that, you know, it's a very simplified way of how you would go about, like, translating. They compared it to hieroglyphics, essentially, is what they worked off of. In that, you know, the language is separated into chunks that you then can guess the word part into, and as you learn more, it'll sort of automatically be like, oh, this can't be right anymore, or, you know, this is definitely right, I'm certain of this now, so that your language sort of automatically builds understanding on top of each other for you. Whereas like in Guitar Hero, right, you're doing all these like complicated things with just like 5 buttons, where if it was on an actual guitar, it'd be way more than 5 buttons, but it's still a good way of abstracting guitar playing for a game purpose, and that's essentially what they've done with linguistics, or what they tried to do with linguistics in Heaven's Vault, which is pretty cool. But the way that one works is that they have like glyphs that will mean like one thing, and then when those glyphs are near other glyphs, it'll compound into another word. So one example is like you have a people glyph and like a know glyph, K-N-O-W glyph. And so if you have like
the other now.
person
Nice.
knowing person, or people knowing people, that means emperor.
Got it. So it's like it's like how you, as an English speaker, learn Japanese, right? It's like how you learn kanji.
Yeah. Sort of like that, yeah.
Yeah. A radicals system.
Yes, like that a bit. And so in that, it's all about, you know, learning the language, and then but there's not a ton of room for failure in something like that. Like you can go under a misinterpreted word for a while, but eventually you'll find enough stuff that the character will be like, actually, this does not seem correct. And like stuff you already know will be filled in for you. So like there's like a little apostrophe type symbol that means of, which is probably going to be like one of the first ones that you're certain of. And there's like various like sort of apostrophe symbols that will mean like conjunction type words that you'll learn over time and will start getting automatically filled in for you.
See, I'm feeling like this needs to be the next genre of game that Clickbait Boyfriend and I get really into. The most recent genre was Trine. Now it's linguistics.
I don't know if you would like Heaven's Vault or not. It's very ambitious in its open-endedness in the translation, and the way that you can just sort of go wherever you want in the world and stumble into the ending accidentally, like I did. And I think that can be frustrating in the way it works sometimes. But the translation part is quite fun.
I sort of hope that Tunic inspires more of that. I hope we see a wave of translation-focused indies in like 2 or 3 years.
Tunic sort of seems like it was made by complimentary freaks.
Yeah.
For freaks.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much it will like catch on, I guess. Because you haven't even talked about like their audio language.
The audio language was where Clickbait Boyfriend and I like kind of gave up like right at the very end. Like we got the true ending, which we were totally on the wrong track. Like we thought we had to do a bunch of the like very secret stuff to get to the true ending, but you don't. You don't have to do that. We like whatever. None of like these words are spoilers. We found all the fairies. We started finding like a lot of the 12 treasures because we thought we had to find all of the 12 treasures to get to the real ending, which you don't. Spoiler, it's separate. Yeah, at a certain point, there was like one of the very last of the treasures that we cheated on. We only cheated like 3 times in Tunic, so I feel good about myself. But yeah, that like super secret language, that's weird.
It seems mostly, it doesn't really seem like it necessarily adds a ton of meaning, I guess. It's just meant to be there to be, because they thought it was fun.
Yeah.
Reading Kevin Reganey, there's a thread on it after it came out. Essentially, you know, they put the symbols in the spectrogram that comes out from the audio, and then there's certain like note progressions that will match to whatever glyph is there that corresponds to it, and it'll play things at certain times that correspond to what you're doing in the game. And so it just seems like an extra meaning to like the like typical like from Zelda, you know, that's like, you got it. That's essentially what that means. If I heard that, I would translate it to, you did it, right?
Yeah.
But this one, you could do that and actually have it translate to, you did it, essentially.
Look, just circle things back around to the beginning of the episode here a little bit. Too much work. Why'd you do that?
It was fun. It seems like.
I know.
In the thread, they were like, you know, we put in a lot of stuff that was just for us, right? And we talked about on that episode, they had like their idea of like secret percentages, right? Of what percent of people should be finding this. And this is just like for the true freaks. Complimentary.
It's just hard for me. It's always, and you know, with this whole creation of language and stuff in general, it's like, it's just hard for me to square it with the realities of game production. Mm-hmm. Like, it's hard for me to be like, yes, I get it. That does seem like a lot of work, but it was fun for you. And it's hard for me to think about that in the context of like, but games are impossible to make and a wild amount of work.
Well, Tunic did take a very long time to come out.
I know. That's why I'm like, I don't know. Did you need that? Did you need, like, I could just imagine the publisher being like, you know, why is the music taking so long? Why is the music guy still on payroll right now? Like, this should have been done 2 years ago. And them being like, look, it's a language. And Finji being like, okay.
I mean, in some ways, like, the existence of it does, like, suggest, like, a fuller, more thought-out world, even if you don't know it's there, I guess. Like, the existence of something there, even if you don't engage with it, like, suggests a depth to things, I guess, to even players who are unaware of it.
Right.
So there's value in that, you know. There's value in creating an environment that is fully what you want it to be.
I don't mean to say there's no value in it. It's just in like all of this kind of like language stuff. It's just interesting to me to think about like, okay, what was the meeting about this decision like? Right? Like, how did the cost benefit analysis of like, okay, we're going to develop this whole new language and we're going to have to hire a bunch of linguists and like teach our voice actors this and it's going to give our writers a headache. But like world building, right? Like the balance there. Or like, okay, instead of just doing a soundtrack, our soundtrack's going to have like a secret meaning, right? And I'm sure one part of the balance is like, man, there's sure a bunch of articles about that secret music language in Tunic, right? Yeah. So like that kind of coverage maybe pays for it, I guess. It could. Yeah. But it's always hard for me to think about these kind of like high effort, probably fun for the people involved, but like slow projects as being something that can be part of modern video game design. Because modern video game design just seems to be like, we've got to do what we can to get this out the door, and that's it.
I really liked hearing about the way they worked in the Dovazul, the dragon language in Skyrim. They mentioned they had to have like a database both of like, you know, English to dragon and dragon to English, so that writers could, I assume, either they found something that they didn't write and needed to understand what it said, for one thing, or they needed a word to put in and would need to look that up. But also, like, they started with, like, a list of words, and then writers would come to the language people and be like, hey, I need words for this, and so they would have to continually add to, like, that database of words based on what was needed by the people actually writing for Skyrim, which is just fascinating. Apparently started for, like, just things people would shout for, like, spells and stuff, too.
Right. Fusroda.
Yeah.
Etc.
Which you could think of a lot of, like, magic spells as being, like, a constructed language of some sort.
That's true.
Right? Probably pulling from another language, but making it into its own word. Because a lot of spellcasting systems will have something that you shout. Sometimes it's just Ice Blast, but sometimes you get fancy with it.
Yeah. Force.
Yeah. Exactly. I like that when you cast a spell in Tunic, the music says AoE. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah. The Skyrim's language is the most vibey of them, though. Like, I'm like, good for you guys. Like, you didn't try to, like, language any of this. You were just like, dragons wrote it, so it looks like dragon scratches. Mm-hmm. Syllables mean stuff when we need them to. That's it. I'm like, good for you guys. Skyrim feels like a game where they could have gotten way too into that. And instead they were like, no. 60 words seems like enough. Grammar's where it really gets you.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you're out there thinking, man, I should be doing this as a career, just know that it can be lucrative. This guy, I read the article on this guy, this guy who does all the languages. He was like, his rates scale from like $500 for like super basics all the way up to 6 figures for like full language. I mean, whatever. He's like charging HBO that, right? I'm like, dang.
Everything I read said that you don't get paid very much, actually.
No, unless you're the guy.
Unless you're the guy, the one guy, you do not actually get paid very much. The one certain figure that was there was the BioWare's Thophon, which apparently they put together Wolf Wykely. It's a 2,500 word language they put together, and it paid $2,000 for it, which sounds like not enough to me.
Yeah.
Personally.
So linguistics, and the art of creating fictional languages is just like everything else in that you're going to be underpaid unless you're the guy.
Yeah. Exactly.
But you could be the guy. Who knows?
One day
God
the guy...
probably didn't know he was the guy.
One day the guy may need a replacement. You never know.
Yeah. How many fictional languages can exist in one guy's brain?
All of them, apparently.
Apparently. Well, Emma, any closing thoughts on constructed fake fictional languages and games?
I like it when they're vibey. I don't think I would ever... I mean, I know why people learn fictional languages, so I don't think I would ever do that. I don't think I would ever get enough into something to speak Klingon or whatever.
It just feels like a lot of work when you... I don't mean to diminish this, but for me personally, it feels like a lot of work when you could put that same work into a language that you could, like, actually
To
use.
be fair, if you do speak Klingon, you can actually use it to speak to any Star Trek fan around the world, right?
That is true.
So in some ways, you are preparing yourself to talk to various people who you would get along with.
You know what? I take it back. You're right. I take it back.
The friend-making language.
Well, listeners, have you learned Klingon? Do you know the entirety of the dragon language from Skyrim? Do you feel like you understand your Animal Crossing villagers when they talk to you? Or your Sims when they talk? If you have thoughts on any of this or anything else we talked about this week, hit us up on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat, and read our blog featuring long-running series Clickbait Boyfriend and Split Screen. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, if you enjoy the show, you should subscribe so you never miss an episode on Sundays at noon. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Cast, anywhere that you can find podcasts, wherever you found the podcast today. Subscribe to Talk This.
Next week. We're talking about Parappa the Rapper and Wolong Fallen Dynasty.
Right, and I was like, where do I even play Parappa? Right, it's coming back.
Yeah. So look forward to that.
Well, listeners, that's it for this week's show. Emma, you should sign off in gibberish. Try to do your best, like it sounds like a real language gibberish sign off.
Kuyata. Swinga, swabby, Sigata.